we're ready. No more sound effects, I hope. So welcome. It's the first time that I do the talk with people with popcorn, so it's fun. enjoy it. So I'll do it. I won't do it because I'm not sure my presentation will improve with that. So Blazor for React developers. Who's using React? Everyone, almost. Okay, if you don't use React, don't worry. You should be able to follow it. Presentation of today is about converting your knowledge from React to Blazor, and then get an idea what Blazor might be has to offer for you, and if it's a tool for you. Now, my name is Beerendonk. I'm a software developer from the Netherlands, and I was asked to do this. I generally do a lot of front-end courses, both in Denmark and in Norway, and sometimes in Holland. So I do have a React course, I do have a Blazor course. I organize the courses in a similar form, so I can always see what one technology offers and the other one doesn't offer, or doesn't need to offer sometimes. So great. I was asked to give an overview and how one relates to the other. So I hope you enjoy it. So translating conversion, well, that's something we also do a lot at home. My wife is from Colombia and I'm Dutch, so we do always things like, okay, money conversion. By the way, all Colombian women are millionaires. It's not because they are really so rich necessarily, but it's because like 1 million pesos is a minimum wage in Colombia, and that's around 200 euros. So in kroners you probably can make the thing. Another way to convert is, we Dutch have the very common thing of putting chocolate sprinkles on bread. We think it's delicious. In Colombia they think it's delicious to take hot chocolate and put cheese in it. Yeah, I still can't get used to that. But my wife had to get used to my stuff. And where I live in the area where the flower bulbs grow, so we have a nice flower parade where lots of tourists come. But yeah, we put the flowers on big cars, commercially grown. In Colombia they also have, or in Medellin where she's coming from, they also have a flower parade. But then it's flowers from your own garden, put together by yourself, and then they have a route about 4 kilometers. And these are the these are the big items. They are about 80 to 100 kilos. So after that, the day after, it looks like this. Okay. Hopefully this demonstration won't be as painful for me. First thing, thanks for a few people I spoke over lunch. So now I felt like, oh yeah, I should talk about to learn something new. How do you do that? Well, something to relate to. If you need to learn a new programming language, what will you do? You'll probably think about, okay, what do I have available in our current language that is really essential? Now, you probably want to know, okay, what are the basic types, like the integer type, the booleans? How can I create variables? And then write some code with an if construct, a for loop, how to write a function, maybe write a data object. And if I have that, and I know how to do that in another language, I am probably 60–70% where I should be, and I can program a little in that language. Now the same applies of course to front-end frameworks, so I try to be similar here. So what do you do? Why do you use a front-end framework? You use a front-end framework because otherwise you have one big piece of code. So you have like small components, and you assemble the components into an application. So you can concentrate on one component. Now one component is a mini web page, being both code, user interface and styling, and then you want to synchronize the data that you have in your code with the data you have in your user interface. Okay, so let's talk about components, let's talk about how those parts fit together, and then see about the extras that they have to offer. So, what about React? What about Blazor? React is a web library. Blazor is a web framework. So there's more inside of the box. Both are open source. React is 10 years old. Blazor is 5 years old. Blazor team looked very good at React. So you can make completely client-side applications with both, completely running in the browser, independent of any server. You can also write application server-side. For React you need maybe something like Next.js. Now, and from the server side you can have server-side streaming as well. React Server Components allows that. but there is also streaming rendering in Blazor. And you can work in both platforms to create native applications. By React Native you can go iOS, Android. Same applies to Blazor with Hybrid. Now there is a big difference though. React is one of the frameworks that works on JavaScript, or if you prefer, TypeScript. Blazor on the other hand is C#, and it works on WebAssembly. WebAssembly is something that's relatively new in the browsers. Yeah, you can check, but WebAssembly is in browsers for at least 5 years, so all the browsers should support it. That doesn't mean it is mature. Okay, yesterday when I did a talk, there were some questions about, let's get done with the elephant in the room, yeah, or in the cinema, I would say. Who's using it? Now, if I have this slide about React. All the big companies you can almost think of use React. It's a hugely popular framework. So then, is anyone using Blazor? Well, there's a website where you can check how many websites are using Blazor, and they say there are about 30,000 websites using Blazor. But you probably won't see a big e-commerce website using Blazor. The problem with Blazor is it takes a little longer to start up. Now, we'll talk about that in a moment. Is that a big deal? No, you get a whole, almost a whole .NET framework with it, with lots of functionalities. So you get more. If you add more to React, yeah, it will get slower as well. But there are a few other things. So the second elephant in the room is actually to do about speed. I like this. I generated this with artificial intelligence, and I like it how the elephant on the right hand side actually has a green and a red eye, so probably you can see three-dimensional movies without glasses or something, I don't know. Okay, talking about speed. Now here it is. React with hooks on the left hand, and then Blazor, WebAssembly with ahead of time compilation or compilation while you run the program on the right two columns. And yeah, Blazor is all red. But what do we measure here? The first one is startup metric. Yeah, it takes longer to start up if you have more code to start up. Memory allocation, yeah, that's also more if you have the .NET framework with you. And the duration of certain operations, like updating the user interface. Now, the benchmark link is over there. But so the first question is Blazor really slower? Now, I already said it contains the .NET framework. That takes a longer time to load. It's that simple. Then, since we are in WebAssembly, the DOM API is based on JavaScript. So to be able to update the DOM, and that's actually what the right column here does, lots of things doing with the DOM, you actually see the right table. If you do ahead of time compilation, is not necessarily super bad, but as long as the DOM is purely JavaScript based, it will take a little longer to update the DOM with from WebAssembly, from C#. Is that a problem? It's not the only thing you do in your program. You do lots of other stuff, and that stuff runs just as fast in C# as in JavaScript. WebAssembly is, although it's available, is still in development. It's very close to adding the threads and the garbage collector. So speed should improve more even. Now, okay, there's a third element, a third elephant in the room. I stopped there because now they are going to watch an elephant movie. I see the screen was empty before. So, is Blazor Silverlight number 2? Now, I would say no, because Silverlight was based on browser plugins that only were available for Internet Explorer. Blazor is based on WebAssembly. And also Photoshop now is based on WebAssembly. Photoshop was brought to the browser. Lots of C code. They didn't rewrite that in JavaScript. They just made a compiler, used a C compiler. And so the platform is there. Actually, if you use Silverlight, there's now an open Silverlight implementation. Then you can run Silverlight apps on top of Blazor. So if there is a new technology, we probably can use Blazor on top of that new technology in the future. Okay. I have lots of slides. Let's see. I'll dive into different parts of the application and build it up. Maybe we don't have all the time to see all the parts. Don't worry. At the end, I'll give you an overview and a link where you can see all the slides, so you can explore it for yourself. And I show a few demos, but I have more demos also in the zip file that you can download at the end. Okay, to start a new project. Now, if you do that in React, you probably use Vite or Create React App. Not sure if I can still say that. But you use a command line and you use npm. Now, of course, you can use Visual Studio for new project, create a new Blazor project. But you can also use the command line tool after you've installed the .NET SDK. So you can do .NET New. You say what kind of new project you want. Now there are a few options for Blazor. Traditionally we have WebAssembly for the front end or Blazor server for the back end. And there's now an option that you can choose later. It works almost exactly the same server side or client side. I show you client side, but that should be the same. So you create a new folder with a new project in there. And then you can do .NET Run to run your project. Or .NET Watch Run, then you can have hot reloading, etc. All the cool stuff you are used to in React. Okay, so then you need to bootstrap an application. How does bootstrapping an application look like? Well, similar to React. You create there's an HTML page. In the HTML page is a div that is going to be replaced or the content is going to be replaced by the React app or the Blazor app. Now in case of React, then you need to somehow get access to the root, the identifier root, and say, oh, render the app there. A similar code we have in case of Blazor. We have a builder. In the builder, you say, well, the root div should be connected to an app component. And then you run the builder and the application starts up. I'll show a real example in a moment. Then we have components. So, components in React, function-based. Yes, there's also class-based components. Who's using class-based components? Exactly. So, that's why Blazor has class-based components. No, we work with classes. And under the covers, I'll show you yesterday, they look a lot like what class components in React looked like before, that they had a render method, and there's something similar in the class in Blazor, but we don't need to know about that. Okay, if you talk about a component contains a template part, HTML, code part, now in this case C#, and styling. It's like a mini web page, and instead of having one big component, hopefully you're not having a React application with one component and do everything in that one component. You have lots of components, and those components are mini web pages. Now we have that in Blazor as well. Mini web pages, it's a Razor file. In the Razor file we have Razor syntax, we'll come to that in a moment, instead of JSX. We do have our code part, which can be in a separate file if you want to. Then it should have the same file name as .razor, but then .razor.cs, and you put a partial class in there. But generally we have a code block in the Razor file itself. And you can have styles. You can have inline styles, handy if you want to have some data binding, or you can have it in a separate file, like a separate CSS file. And again, the file then should have the same name as the Razor file where the template is, except it's done .razor.css. So this is what a simple file without any styling looks like. It looks like h1, hello Blazor, h1 to close. That's my HTML. And then I have add code. There I can put my code. So later you can download all the examples. So I have a number of examples about bootstrapping, about having a component. So this is a component, app.razor. You can have multiple lines of HTML or whatever you want. You can have a code block and styling next to it. I'll show the styling in a moment. Now, of course, normally I use Visual Studio to develop, but with the keystroke here, I do .NET Run, and it runs the app. Okay, so this is a basic file without any styling. Let's talk about styling. Now, styling is done in CSS files, and in your React setup, generally you also have a CSS file next to your component. Yes, there's also options to do inline styling, which you can do in Blazor as well. Now, the styles that you have in your CSS files in React are not scoped to your component itself. You have to do something extra, like put a div around it and make sure that everything that's within that div that's styled specifically. In Blazor, you don't have to think about that. If you do any styling in Blazor, it's automatically for that component. So, for example, I have here my program. In my program, I'll start the application. Then I have my top component. The top component has just some HTML. And I will talk about it later. I'll repeat that later. Some other component. Now, other components, just like in React, start with a capital or Pascal cased. HTML should be lowercased. That's also what Blazor expects. Then we have the middle component. That's our component. That one also shows in H1 with a bottom component. And then I have a bottom component. Now, why do I have this set up? Because I say in the middle component, the styling for an H1 should be red. So the question then is, okay, I have an H1 in every component. Is every component going to be red? No, luckily not. Everything is black. That's because the first time it remembers being from the same URL what I had before. So here, if I refresh, then I get the proper styling. You see that only the middle component's H1 is now styled red. And that's done by adding an attribute to the H1 of the middle component, and that attribute is a Blazor hash, and that's being used in the style as well. So Blazor actually adjusts the CSS. And it makes sure the styles are scoped. So styles in a separate CSS file. You can also do inline styling. Inline styling just like this, but imagine, I'll talk about data binding in a moment. Imagine that the color red is not fixed, but it's depending on some data that I have. So then you data bind depending on red. If you don't want to do that with CSS classes, then you don't do it based on styling on the CSS class, but you do it based on direct inline styling. Now, more common is to have it in a separate file, so I'll show that a moment ago, and those styles are actually processed. So, Blazor makes sure the style only applies to your component and your component only, and if you want to, it could be your component and the components underneath, and then it bundles all the styles. So in the page, there's just one CSS file that's being generated that contains the styling of all the components. And the styles are scoped. Okay, so we have seen CSS. We have seen how to write a code block and how to write the HTML. Now let's talk about data binding. Generally in your code you have some state and you want to show that to the user. Otherwise, why would you have the state in the client? Now, for data binding, we actually use JSX in React, which is a separate technology. You can also use it in Vue. And we have Razor syntax in Blazor. If you're used to Razor syntax, because you also on the back end are familiar with ASP.NET, it's the same technology. Now, JSX doesn't have any extras, just the curly braces almost. That's not the case with Razor. The Razor has a lot of special keywords. For example, add code is one to have a code block, but there are more things. We are defining components, and the components might need to inherit something or implement an interface or work with dependency injection. So there are more reserved words in Razor than in JSX. Okay, let's look at data binding. Data to view. I have some data and I want to see that in a HTML component. Now let's first talk about the content between the opening and the closing tag. So this is my component code. Hello, add name. The moment you use add, then after that is an expression, in this case the name of a field in my code block, and instead of seeing add name, you will see Blazor. Hello Blazor exclamation mark. That's what you will see. It only happened once, he promised. So here's the example. Just run it. I thought like, hey, the sound is going away, so I'll have some time to run the example, but it's back up even faster than I thought. So hello Blazor. You see the extras is coming from CSS, so if I refresh, that's gone. So add name, after the add could be an expression. You could calculate a few things. In this case we just take the name directly. Now you can also use the name in an attribute like this. If I have an input and I want to set the input value, this is not very useful to do in reality, but not something between the opening and the closing tag, but just an attribute, or what we actually call a DOM property. We are updating the DOM in Blazor. Input value is add name, so it will be calculated based on the value over there. So running this, we should be able to see an input with Blazor inside. So that was the content area, and for a DOM property, basically the same way, use add name. So in React you would have used curly braces. Now, you can also use C# if and C# for and for each to produce lists. So how do you produce a list? Common, if you have an array, down at the bottom in my code I have items, 1, 2, 3 in there. Then I want to create an unordered list with 3 list items, or as much as there is an item. You can use a for each statement for that, or a for loop if you prefer that. If you want to do link inside, if you want to convert the items or do a filter on the items, you can all do that in the code above. And at some point you jump. The moment you start with the add sign, it's just like curly braces in JSX. You move into JavaScript. In this case, you move into C# code. The moment then you start with the tag, you are back in Razor syntax, and sometimes you have to do it multiple levels. That also applies to JSX. So since I'm now in HTML-like syntax again, I have to use the add sign to write some C# code again. One more thing about the list. If you have a list of 1,000,000 items, then you blew up the browser, so that's not a great idea. They have a built-in solution, Virtualize. There's an example in my code. I don't think I have time to show it. Now, also, sometimes you want to render something at times and sometimes not, depending on some circumstance. Then you can use an if-else, normal C# if-else, based on some variable, visible, in this case false. Either the first list item or the second list item is shown. Okay, so that was all about putting data on the screen, sometimes putting a list on the screen, or putting something conditionally on the screen. Now the other way around. Now we have the user interface, and now our user wants to interacts with it, and we want to know that the user clicked something or typed something. So how? Well, we have to handle an event. The add sign is now before the event name. Add on click. So in React it is not with on. Always, it's all lowercase. And just like in React, you connect to a method, and that method you do without the braces. We don't call it. We connect the method to the on click event. In there, get a list of arguments or an arguments object, you can leave it out if you don't use it. Me being a very old C# developer, then we always had to have the parameter list exactly correct. In this case, you don't mind. If you don't want to use the mouse event args, you can just leave them out. I don't use them here, but I just mentioned them. So now when you click the button, the method is called. Okay. So that was the data binding. Hopefully you already have seen some C# and Blazor. Then yeah, it's very much like JSX and the JSX capabilities. Let's talk about state. If you have your component, you want to have some data in there. Now I already had some fields. In case of React, you should not use a normal variable in your function. In case of Blazor, we just use a field. In React, we use useState. And that has a particular reason. If you then update the state, React wants to know that it has changed. So Angular and Vue used some magic to figure out if some data has changed. Yeah. So that's why Angular now went to signals, because it doesn't work perfectly. So in React we use useState. Then React knows exactly, okay, state has changed. Let's update the user interface. Now Blazor doesn't work like that, and it doesn't do the magic either that Vue and Angular do. You can change a field and then the UI doesn't update normally. They have the principle that if there is a user interface event, after that event takes place, we run the code, and after that we'll update the user interface. Because probably state has changed. So Blazor simply says if there is an event, you click the button or you type something in an input. After that we'll see if the UI should be updated. So a very simple mechanism. And then you exactly know, okay, it's updated synchronously. If you run an asynchronous event handler, it's also at the end of the asynchronous event handler is also updating the user interface. So it's a very straightforward mechanism. If you want to force an update, you can do that in the middle. Okay. State data is internal to the component, as opposed to properties that you can get from a parent. The state lives as long as the component is alive. If the component goes away, your state is going away. Now, and re-rendering the UI, I'll talk about that. So this is an example of some simple state and how to update it. I have a button. In the button I showed how many times the button is clicked. In the code you can see the count is 0, that's where we start. Every time we click the button we call the handle click method and we update the count. Now because it's a UI change after this function has run, Blazor is updating the user interface. Okay. Now we have one component. We have seen how we can have data in a component, update the user interface, display the user interface, and have some styling there. How to combine multiple components. Now I've shown you how one component can call another component, but we didn't see how we can pass data from a component to another component. Now I talked about this. If you have components, then start with a capital Pascal case. So this is how you call a component if you don't have to pass data. But of course you want to pass some data through properties. Now, in case of React, the components are functions. So you pass function arguments. Or actually one called props, and that's containing all the data and all the functions you want to pass. Now in case of Blazor, you do that through class properties. So a normal, plain old C# property. But it should have an attribute at top parameter. So properties are delivered to the component from the parent. Something like this. So greeting, the name should be Blazor. Or the name should be whatever @name the name field has. Properties by default are optional, and there are some ways to get them required. So maybe you want to leave out the name and have a proper default. Now then in your, let's say child component, the parent passes the data, the child, the greeting component, could look like this. It will have a normal property. Public string name is now with a getter and setter, and you can make the public, private, what you want. And it has a parameter on top. And that, because there's a parameter on top, that's how the parent can then give it a value. Now the name can then be used, of course, in your user interface. Now they are optional by default, so maybe consider giving it a proper default so the parent component doesn't always have to pass on values. Okay, but you might not only want to pass down data. Maybe you want to know when the child actually updates some data and you want to know about it. So a parent component can change the properties of a child component, but if it can also subscribe to events. So a parent can then register an event handler, or basically pass a function, and then the child can raise the event, so the parent can know something happened in the child. And if you want to pass more data down the whole component tree, you can do that because a child component, it can be a parent to another component, and step by step we can pass data down. There's no Redux-like thing in Blazor. Okay, so the parent component, we have seen how to pass down data. We can also pass down a function. So whatever you call the function, in this case I call it in the child on-click callback, add child changed, and then you can have your function with event arguments if you want to have some data. Now, but you have to define them. In this case I'll say I have them, but I don't have them actually. In the child component, in this case I did have them. Event arguments in the child component, just like a property that receives data, you now have a property with a parameter on top. That's all the same, but the type is a special one. The type is event callback, and then if you send back data, the data that you want to send back, the data type that you want to send back. Then at some point in your component something happens, so if I click this button, this function is executing. In that case I can say this dot onClick callback, and now how to notify the parent. The onClick callback, being an event callback, has an invoke async method. I call that method, I pass the data I want to pass, and then the parent, so I'll go back here, the parent is connecting to a method, so that method is then being called with the data that we sent. Yeah, so properties and events look very much alike. You make a C# property with parameter on top. In case of events, you have a dedicated type called event callback, which is a generic, and you can define what data, potentially data, you want to send. Okay, now so far you have seen things that are the same in React and in Blazor. Now handling forms in React, React doesn't really have something for handling forms. They basically tell you, okay, it's there in an HTML page, good luck, use that. So you probably use a library like React Forms or anything to keep your state synchronized with your form data, and maybe to do some validation messages as well. Now actually Blazor has a functionality for this. So you don't use the form, but you use a special form control. And you don't use the input, but you use special input controls. On top of that, it allows you to do validation based on a model with data annotations. If you're used to ASP.NET, that might be something similar. The form wrapper they have automatically prevents the form from sending the data straight to the server. And the standard web functionality is, if you have a form and you submit the form, the data is sent back to the server. And your page will be unloaded because the browser gets new data. That's prevented already for you. You don't have to do that. Now, the form also can handle validation, integrates nicely with C#. So, instead of using the standard forms, you have a special type, and also there are for the HTML elements like input of type checkbox, date, file, etc. We do have special Blazor components. So be aware of that and use them. Yes, you can use the standard HTML elements, but you have to do more by yourself. So what's the base? Underneath a form is a model. So in React, we will have multiple state fields for every input. In this case, you have a model class, and the model class can have multiple properties, and every property then is connected to a single field. Now, in this case, the model has just one property, Blazor, and this model class can have restrictions. For example, the value is a required field. The form cannot be submitted if that field is not having a value. Then in your component, you can use your form. So you create a new form in your code, a model in your code. You create the form in your HTML, in your template, and you connect the model there. Then you use special input text with add bind value. Now this feels a bit like magic, but yesterday I showed that if you have in your model of bind value, I showed that this input text actually has an event called value changed and a property value. So if you have a combination of a property and an event where they have the same name, value, and then the event is then value changed, that combination with then add bind uses both and generates here automatically an event handler to create two-way data mining. So by connecting the input text to the model value property, if the model value changes, the input text changes. If the user types something in the input text, automatically the model value property is changing. So just a simple example, although simple, in this case I have a required field, let's call it name, that also has a certain string length, maximum of 10. Then in my code I generate that model, and that model is connected to a edit form over here. Then I have a field for the name, and I can submit the form through a button. Now, if you submit the form, actually validation is taking place. The validation can take place by looking at these data annotations. So I add to the form a Blazor component, data annotations validator, that will actually check is the data that the user filled in line with what it should be. If not, show it. Now you can show it per field. This shows it just as a summary at the top. And it also prevents the unsubmit. There's not just an unsubmit on the form. Yes, there is, but you don't want to use it in this case. I want to know when there is a valid submit. If not, I don't care in my code. Probably too fast. Oh, here it is. So here's my form. If I don't submit anything, it's a required field. And yes, I have some styling. Oh no, in this case not. I hope to add some red styling. The field is the name is required. Okay, let's have a very long name, more than 10. Submit. Oh, the field is too long. Okay, let's have a short name. I'm called Rick, so submit it, and now I can take the result and do something with it. So the errors are automatically shown. There's an onValid submit, which is connected to an event handler here. So that method is down in my code block, and then I'll do something with the result, and I could potentially create a new model to connect to the form. So form handling is done with, you don't have a special tool for that, it's in the box already. There's a lot more in the box. So the only way to work with data right now is passing data every component to the child, to the child, to the child. Maybe you want to pass data further down the chain without doing it step by step through all the components step by step. In React you can do that with a context, and that's called cascading values and parameters. They couldn't find a shorter name with React, with Microsoft in Blazor. Now in React we'll have a context object, and in that object you can have multiple values that you can push down as a whole. Now in Blazor we don't have that. It's just one value that you pass down, but you can give the value a specific name. Then if you have a context, then you provide the values using a provider, a context.provider component. In case of Blazor, that is a cascading value component. But for the rest you use it like the provider. You wrap a piece of user interface, you say cascading value, and then you pass values down. Now in the React component you generally use the useContext hook to get the values. In case of Blazor, it's actually like writing a normal property with not a parameter on top, but cascading parameter on top. That's it. So what problem do we solve? We solve the problem that you pass data down multiple layers, and then normally you have to pass it down every step by step. I'll have some code slides in a moment as well, but here just one parameter. I have a component at the top, a component at the middle. In the middle component creates a bottom component, but it doesn't pass on any properties. The middle component does not have any properties itself, but the bottom component wants to use it. So the bottom component has a property called color, but not marked with parameter, but marked with cascading parameter. So it doesn't have to be the direct parent that delivers the value. Now right here, it should get a value. It shows the text bottom, and the text bottom is in red. Now, so a value must have been passed. It's not passed from the middle component, but it's actually passed from the top component. How? By using a cascading value. So we don't have to create a context. We directly use like context.provider here, cascading value, and we pass down a value. Now, if you want to pass down multiple values, you can give every value its own name, and then you can use, where you consume it, you can say, oh, I want to use the name A or the name B. So that could be based by name. So in this example, I like to have two cascading values, a color and a background color. Now, both are strings, so it's really hard to know which one is which by type. So well, one should be called background color and the other one color parameter. And then if I pass the front-end color, I do a cascading value here, and then with the name, color parameter. Or in case of middle where I pass the background, I say the name of the cascading value I pass is a background color parameter. So this is how you can have multiple values. Use the name.
Question?
Yes, go ahead.
Do you have to list the cascading values? Would that be the pattern, or would you then expand the value to be like a complex object instead?
You can do both.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't. If it's just two values, maybe I don't make a special object. But otherwise, I would go for the object option. Yes, that's definitely what I do. Just like context, if you pass the same value or the same name but multiple times a value, the one closest to the consuming part is winning. So it works exactly like React. The Blazor team actually looked at React. So you get the best of what you already know with Razor, for example, for ASP.NET, plus actually what you know in React. Now, instead of passing back values, you can also pass back down functions. So deeper down, they can actually notify a component higher up that something has changed. So here's some code slides. If you go through this, then you have an idea. Then we have dependency injection, something we don't have in React. Now, and based on dependency injection, or with dependency injection, we can actually have like a Redux implementation or a global state one. If you want to use fetching data, you have to use an HTTP client to fetch data. Now you can get that through dependency injection. Dependency injection just works like ASP.NET. So React doesn't have it in Blazor. You define some service, an object, generally. You can define if that is a singleton service, so should it be the same in the whole application, or is it transient? Every time that somebody wants an instance of the service, we create a new one. And last, you need to inject the service somewhere in your component, so you can use add inject. And if you use code behind, it looks a bit different. But so define a server. This is for an example. Now, I define an interface, iLogger, and in that interface I say, well, okay, everything that implements iLogger should implement the info method. Then I have here an implementation of the logger server's iLogger. Then you need to register it. You can do that with add singleton or add transient. And in case of an interface, you generally say, well, if you want an iLogger, deliver an instance of logger servers. If you have done something like this in ASP.NET, it works the same. So this is just a simplification. Now, and then in your component, you can get access to a logger service. Or in a service, you can actually get access to another service if you want to. So with a special Blazor add inject, I say inject a logger. In this case, this example says directly give me a logger service. Now you get an instance of that because the implementation, but it should actually maybe be iLogger in this case. Have a question?
Is there support for third-party tools like Simple Inject or something else, or is that?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's something I don't know because I haven't tried.
It's just .NET.
Okay, so you can do the same.
You could use,
Yeah. So the answer here is for. It should be possible because it's just .NET. Yeah. So everything is really based on top of each other. I'm happy with this. Maybe I'm too simple for. Yeah. Okay, and then you can use the logger service. So dependency injection. I'll have here an example without. Here's the logger service. It doesn't implement an interface. Logger service. Unique identifier, so then we can see how many times it is created. Then in my program I define that it is a singleton. I'll define it's a singleton. Then I have an app component that also creates a greeting component. Now the app component consumes the logger service, and on initialized, when the on initialized is a lifecycle method that takes place a little later when the injection has been taken place. So then I know I have access to the logger and I can write some info, which is then in the browser console. Now the greeting does the same thing. It also asks for a logger. So if I then run it, then in the browser I should see that in the DevTools down here I can see the app component is created logger1, the greeting component is created logger1. If I then define this should be add transient, now I'll have a look here. I can see that logger1 is being used for the app component and logger2 is being used for the greeting. So you indeed get multiple instances. Okay, now there is no Redux-like solution. Of course, somebody has made something like that, or you can use your own. But with dependency injection, you can actually make a class that you use as a singleton and share it with your whole application. In that class, you can have then not only data, but also maybe a notification method or event that everybody can listen to. Yeah, so no out-of-the-box solution, but through dependency injection, you can maybe do something similar. Now then, probably the last thing to show for today is about a router. If you create a new Blazor project, you automatically get a router inside. Now in React, a router is a separate project you likely use. but it's here inside of the box. No third-party option needed. So we have a router. In the router, we have the option, the router will go to the app component. Then you will generally have a pages folder with components that represent a certain URL. So per URL, we say this page should be represented by this component. And yes, you can have some layout around it, so make sure that every page has the same header and the same footer. Now with the router is also a navigation object, so you can actually do redirections, move in code somewhere. And you can work with dynamic pages, and nothing worse than you want to have a customer page with just information of one customer, and that need to be dedicated. So development time, you need to know what kind of customer you already have. If you have 1 million customers, you don't want to generate yourself 1 million pages. So the app component contains the router, the pages folder contains pages. So in a simple scenario, the pages folder, and this is maybe too simple, the one with links. I have a home page, and the home page matches at page / the home URL. If you have page 1, that one matches page 1, and page 2 matches page 2. That's the only thing. For the rest, there are normal Blazor components. Then the app is a bit different. The app has a router. It says what to do if there is a component, a page component that matches the URL, and what to do if there's a page component that doesn't match the URL. Now let's refresh it, and the CSS updates. I can go to page 2, and then in the URL I can say page 1, and I go to page 1. So the back button nicely works. Now I went to the server at some point by typing in the URL. Now I did a few things. This actually doesn't go to the server. It just stays in the client, and the URL changes. So this every page has a default layout, default header and footer, but you can actually choose to have an alternative one. If there's a page not found, here you define what the user will see. Now, this is a simple page implementation to match different URLs. You can have dynamic routing as well by using, just like in React Router, curly braces and put some name in there. So /page/ now whatever follows after it, there should be an identifier that I use. You get that as a parameter, just a property parameter. This will get the value of the identifier. It's as simple as that. You can restrict what that identifier then is. So it must always be an integer, for example. If it's a string, then it will say, oh, this page is not found if the URL is being used. Okay. Now there is a bit more about templated components, lifecycle methods, just like in good old class-based React. We have access to the JavaScript and the DOM, so if you want to use a JavaScript library, you can do so by calling the functions over there. There's a solution for fetching, and some optimizations. One of is working with virtualized. So, final conclusion. We have a lot of things in React that we also have in Blazor. Maybe we'll have a few more things in Blazor, although the next slide I'll show you a few things that might be missing. So we have data mining, we have styling of components, we have state. You have properties and events. There is something extra to handle forms, so we don't need a third-party library for that, and as well as form validation. There's a context, we have dependency injection. We can work with component lifecycles. We had in class components in React special lifecycle methods. That's also what Blazor has. In function components, it's generally replaced with use effect. Now, there must be something extra to access the DOM and JavaScript, because that can only be because we are not in JavaScript. Of course, React doesn't need to do anything for that. The same with fetch is in the browser, but in the .NET framework we use a special one. Now the router is built in. And then we have extras like templated components, dynamic components, error boundaries. Not all the front-end frameworks have that, but it's there in Blazor, and server-side rendering. Now, something that's specific to React, we don't have portals, in case you know what portals are. Anyone used a portal? One hand. So this is probably something you miss directly. Now, yeah, of course, if you like hooks, that type of functionality is not there. What you can do with the hooks, you can do in Blazor. There's no Redux. Maybe a third-party solution for that. And the suspense that you have client-side, that's not available client-side in Blazor. On the other hand, Blazor is not a library. Blazor is a framework. It gives you the .NET library with all the features in there. Better way to handle months, for example. Month doesn't start with 0 for January. Of course, we have seen the forums and dependency injection, but there's also a virtualized list and a quick grid. Quick grid is to quickly create a grid, and a virtualized list is to make sure that if you want to display 1,000,000 items, you basically say, oh, here's a list or access to a list of 1,000,000 items, and then the virtualized list says, yeah, but I only can show 20 items. I'll load 25, so if you scroll a little, then it seems like it's there, and then I quickly load the items that come into view, and the items that go out of view, I remove them from memory as quick as possible. So, to be performant. It's out of the box, it's great. That's what I had. This is the link, or use the QR code if you want to download the material, the examples, the presentation. I went in rather high speed through this, but I think then you have a nice overview. Hopefully you were able to relate what you know in React, what's here in Blazor. If you go deeper, like virtualized, for example, if you are there, then you see nicely how all the base parts of Blazor build up and are combined to create solutions that are a bit tougher, like virtualize. As opposed to many front-end frameworks where I see that for every new thing they need to have a new construct with new magic. In case of Blazor, we don't have the new magic. It is really just .NET code, very open, very clear what it does, and building on top of each other. It's really thought through a lot. Are there any questions? No? I hope that you have now a better understanding what Blazor offers. It's up to you when to use it. We had during lunch a small conversation. I can't tell you what's the best for you. I said depends on your background. If you are a C# developer, great. If you never did too much JavaScript, then it's probably the right tool. If you've never done C#, probably you shouldn't start with Blazor. Yeah? I heard there's a Flutter application in here. You know what the decision is. Flutter, great technology. Is it the right tool? Is it the right application to have in this company right now? That's the question. So it's up to you to decide if it's something for you. I can't tell you. Thank you for attending.